Hello and welcome to episode 8 of the Mountain Ground podcast. For today, we have a special addition to the team, Megan, which we'll introduce you to a bit later. And we have Frederik here today. Unfortunately, Mountain Abandon will not be joining us today. They are in the Drakensberg at the time of this recording. We do look forward to hearing how that trip in the Drakensberg went, and in the next episode we'll get some feedback from them. So in today's episode we will be discussing everything coffee processing related. You've probably seen a coffee where it says processed and it says washed, natural or honey processed, and you've probably wondered if the bean is clean or not. And that's not entirely true, and we will be explaining what that actually means. Then we will be introducing you to Megan, chatting away on a shot in the dark, how things have been progressing there, and then how actually your coffee processing method impacts your flavor and how you roast the coffee. And then we'll be chatting away on the latest trends within the space of coffee processing. So yeah, I think as a starting point, let's introduce you to Megan. So Megan is the latest addition to the Gegrond family. She comes from a coffee background / medical background / surfing background. And so Megan, can you maybe just give the listeners a bit of an overview of yourself and your role here at Gegrond?
Okay, so I'm Megan Utley, in case anyone struggles to pronounce my surname. I was born in 1993. I'm kidding. Okay, so basically, I'm Megan. I come from I would call a baby coffee background, but I got really excellent training and mentorship from one of the top baristas in South Africa. So that's where I come into the Gegrond family. But me as a person, I got halfway through med school, and I decided that a good cup of coffee can save lives. So that's my life mission now, is to save lives through making really good coffee. And I find that Gegrond does that probably daily. So so just me as a person, I love not as adventurous as Peter and Frederik. So you won't find me running in the Drakensberg on mountains. I'm a bit clumsy, so that would be the end. But you'll definitely find me happily on a beach surfing, competing in sports. I really enjoy sport a lot. Obviously enjoying small things like fishing and stuff like that. And you'll also often find me competing in Call of Duty online. One of the few girls that take the flack that comes with that. And then just spending time with my husband. He's been really lovely and supportive through my coffee journey, so it's been great.
Yeah, well, we can definitely say that, you're quite diverse, from saying you're not outdoors to listing all the things you do outdoors, and then on top of that, having Call of Duty. So, no, it's an absolute, we are thrilled to have you on board. And for those out there, if you ever want to reach out to us to discuss like coffee training or, Megan would be more than happy to help you guys out. And like I said, we're really just stoked to have you on board. So now back to a shot in the dark. So I think if you're new to this podcast, a shot in the dark is the competition where it's basically the Olympics of coffee roasting in South Africa. So I don't know, that's just the nationals. Okay, fine. It's the nationals of coffee roasting in South Africa. Last year we took the top spot, and we now are in the process. We've received the green beans, which we are tasked to roast, and Frederik and the team has done, and Leonard and Megan have done a great job, and they've submitted basically the coffee that will be judged, and we are waiting for the top 10 to be announced, which, if I recall correctly, it's at Creative Coffee Week, which is in a week's time, the 27th or 9th. What's the official date for?
Hey everyone, Frederik here. I've just been sitting silently in the background listening to Megan introducing herself. I must say, taking on the boys in Call of Duty is definitely not an easy task. You can imagine there's a lot of ridicule, so well done. Peter, like you said, Shot in the Dark placing will be announced at Creative Coffee Week next week. That's the top 10 placing, so it's the first round of roasting. Then if we place in the top 10, fingers crossed, we'll receive the coffees for the second round. I'm not sure if that will run in the same manner as last year. They haven't communicated exactly what will happen in the second round, but we are excited and we are positive.
Yeah, and I mean, like...
Leonard...
Sorry, like, Frederik,
Yeah.
I just want to give everyone a bit of a background. This was a really challenging coffee to roast. I think we've said it in our mailer. We've been very vocal about it. It has not been the easiest coffee to roast, but a week or so ago, I was quite lucky, and someone brought me one of the final roasts that has been submitted, and I was blown away. It was really one of the most interesting, complex, sweet coffees that I've had in a while, and so yeah, just from my end, you guys have done an incredible job. No matter the results, I think you guys can be really proud of that roast.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, definitely credit to Leonard for doing the roasting. I think obviously, like everything, I'm not really good with team sports, but I feel like Gegrond team sport is we're doing well. But yeah, that coffee is quite interesting. We struggled to get the complexity out of it. It was kind of, it's a Tanzania from the Ngorongoro crater. And like any Tanzania, you expect citric notes and a bit of acidity, but we just couldn't really find a lot of acidity in it. And we also only found like really notes of citric flavor. And but eventually, it was quite interesting the way that we found the roast profile that we used. It's the first way that we roasted this way, and it was kind of by accident that we found out about this profile. Megan and I, we went through to Hostex with Evan from Mulwicks, and Brandon from Mulwicks as well, and we went to listen to Stevo Kuhn compete at the Nationals, and he was talking about his coffee, and he was mentioning it's a really dense coffee, which is kind of exactly what we received. This Tanzania is quite dense. It's a washed coffee. So he's competing, and he mentioned that the coffee was roasted in Switzerland, the one that he was using, and that this roastery has a very specific way of roasting dense coffees. And what they basically do is just before first crack, they increase the energy in the roast to the maximum amount. He didn't disclose any specifics, but that's basically all he said. Contrary to what everyone does generally, is you taper down the gas closer to first crack, because first crack is that exothermic reaction. You don't want to burn the coffee. But yeah, we called Leonard. We said, listen, try this. We don't really know exactly what to do, but try something in this line. And that's exactly what he did. And yeah, the coffee came out really complex and a lot more flavor. Really beautiful.
Yeah, no, that is definitely, like I said, it was great. I had it at the top of Current 2 Hill, which is the highest mountain in Ireland, on Monday morning. So obviously before that also as well, but I remember thinking this is really a great coffee. But yeah, fingers crossed, we would definitely be happy with top 10 in this year's Shot in the Dark. And yeah, so like Frederik was saying, that so in that instance that was a washed coffee, and basically that means something in the coffee world. And I'm going to try and explain on as simple as I possibly can what the coffee processing is all about. But before I get there, I think it's really important just to understand what a coffee cherry looks like. And, you know, if you basically what the different layers of this cherry entails, and then ultimately what the purpose of the processing method is. Okay, so firstly, it's just like the name said, it is actually a cherry. It looks like a cherry. It's red. Well, if you try it, it's red. Otherwise, it's green. And then so you have on the outside you have the fruit. Okay, and then this is usually it's a quite moist, sugary, fleshy pulp type of thing. So just underneath the skin, on the skin, then you have the pulp, and that's usually called like the mucilage, and then it's usually sticky, and so that's the first part of it, and underneath this pulp, you basically get a small film called the silver skin. So you have the cherry. Outside the cherry, you have the skin. Then you have the pulp, and then you have the silver skin, and then you get to the real center and the heart of the coffee cherry, which is the two beans. Sometimes there's only one, but usually there's two. and then once you've actually gotten to that point, a fundamental part of roasting coffee is to reduce the moisture content to about 9 to 12% before you actually roast the coffee. So, and that's where the different processing methods actually comes to play. So if you look at the main methods of processing coffee, you get three methods of processing coffee. You get the natural processed coffee, you get the pulp natural processed coffee, and you get the washed processed method for processing coffee. And for the natural method of processing coffee is that you basically dry out the whole cherry. So the pulp on the outside, you basically dry the cherry up to a certain moisture content, and then only afterwards to actually remove the pulp from the coffee cherry. And then you get the second one, which is the pulp natural coffee, which is generally that could also be referred to as a honey processed coffee. So in this method of processing, you've removed the pulp, and then what's left is this bit of mucilage. I always struggle with that word, and that's the sticky part on the coffee bean, and you then leave it on a basically, I don't know, what's the best way? Maybe what would be the best way to describe that? It's like a sieve type of thing. It's basically a sieve where you would be drying out the
raised beds.
Raised beds.
Yeah, the African raised beds. Yeah.
African raised beds.
Yeah.
That's the one. So, and then you'll basically be drying it, and that's generally called a honey processed coffee, or a processed natural coffee, a pulp natural coffee. And then depending on how much mucilage you've left on it, it can be either a black or a yellow or, different honey processed coffee. And then you get the washed coffee. So the washed coffee process is basically you've removed the pulp, which is the outer skin and the flesh, and then the beans with the mucilage you would be adding into basically a container, fermentation container. So you use fermentation to remove the mucilage. And within that container, the reaction of the water starts removing the mucilage, and depending on depending on the climatic conditions, that will vary how long that fermentation process actually takes place. So I hope that makes sense to everyone in terms of the three main methods of processing coffee. What we at the moment have to offer is, we have more natural actual coffee, natural processed coffee. So like our Timor-Leste, our Brazil Cerrado, our Colombia El Puente, our Burundi. Those all, not our Burundi. So our Colombia, Brazil, and Timor-Leste, all natural processed, and then we also have the Tanzania and the Burundi, both which are washed processed coffees. So that's basically a run through of the three main methods for processing coffee.
I think the important thing for all of us to know is that in 2015, a really well-renowned barista called Sasa Sastic used a processing method called carbonic maceration, which we'll get to a bit later. But I think that kind of made the whole world sit up and pay attention to all these different processing methods and how flavors can be changed. Because at the end of the day, coffee is coffee, right? Like you can only do so much with it. So farmers can't completely change their land, but what they can do is change their processing method. So I just want to, for those people that aren't complete coffee like freaks like me or professional like me, when we refer to flavors in coffee, we often, or how we taste coffee is we refer to the amount of sweetness, the amount of body, the amount of acidity, the flavors that we find in it, and then the finish. So this can just help people understand a little bit better about the actual processing methods. All right, so the natural or the dry processing, it's generally seen as being quite inexpensive because, as we said, we're literally just letting it do its natural thing and degrade on its own. Okay, and that's generally found in parts of the world where water access is a bit difficult. So I think Ethiopia and Brazil is probably a good example to use. Okay, so natural processing used to be pretty much set out for low quality or coffee that wasn't ripe. So it got a bit of a bad rep. Okay, but now we are now starting to find really nice natural coffees. And that's because what farmers are doing is by using natural processing, we're actually getting the flavor from the actual coffee fruit itself and not so much just the seed. All right, so that's where we get a lot of fruity flavors from, right? Because coffee is actually a fruit and it contains sugars. So natural coffees generally can have hints of blueberry and strawberry and tropical fruits. Okay, but like the downside of that can be that we can land up with a bit of wild and fermented flavors and even some manure. So it does take a bit of a challenge for farmers to make sure that they don't have coffee that literally tastes like manure. Okay, but high quality coffees that are now natural are changing the coffee landscape. Okay, and that can be a bit polarizing for people. But we get these beautiful high quality coffees from lots that are changing people's opinions. They're super sweet and fruity. Okay, but if we have one bad lot from a farmer, it can obviously discourage them from purchasing and processing it the same way again. So it's quite a hard thing, but we can generally expect nice, diverse, bold and fruity flavors that are inherited from the actual fruit on the coffee bean or the seed. Okay, and it's going to have a heavier body because there's more sugar in it. Okay, so we can expect a full-bodied coffee with notes of citrus and lime acidity. Okay, and then strong, sweet strawberry jam-like flavors. Okay, so just because it's all the actual fruit that's on the coffee and then a mixture of the seed. Okay, when we get to wet processing, people will often refer to a clean cup. And that's not because it actually got washed. It has more to do with the actual flavors. Okay, so they use the word, yes.
And I just would say in like before the natural processed coffees and and the honey processed coffees became a thing, like there was a perception that washed coffees are generally more expensive and well sought after because the coffee looks a little bit different, and that was generally perceived as being a good quality, which actually has changed quite substantially in the last probably 50 or so years. So yeah, just thought I'd throw that fun fact in there.
No, you're completely right. The perfect example of an expensive washed coffee is a geisha.
Yeah.
Literally, it's going to come up now, so don't stress. Okay, so the reason why we call washed coffees clean is because we are basically only really tasting the flavor that's in the seed. Okay, and that's why they refer to it being clean. All right, they're generally well balanced. They're quite complex. Okay, and they have a bit of a renounced acidity. Okay, and they have a silky, delicate tea-like body. And then the range of notes that you get from it can be from star fruit through to deep dark chocolate. Okay, but it's more commonly floral and not as commonly fruity. Okay, because we're not tasting the actual fruit from the coffee bean as the coffee itself. All right, so this is also found in Latin America and Africa where water is abundant. So if you think of a place like Tanzania, where they have Mount Kilimanjaro, they can actually use the water that will naturally flow off the mountain range to wash their coffees. Okay, so because the coffee fruit is basically washed off, which is not 100% correct, but it's technically washed off. Okay, we are literally tasting what is in the actual seed and therefore in the soil that the farmer grows it in. Okay, so like I say, clean doesn't necessarily mean it's better. It just means that the flavors in washed coffees they're not really masked by the fruit. So you have to be a bit more of a coffee connoisseur to pick up flavors in wet and washed processed coffees, because they not as muffled as it is in a fruity dry processed coffee. Okay, so they generally don't have as much acidity, but they can build acidity through the fermentation process, which the farmer will have to monitor quite carefully. Okay, they are balanced and complex, and they generally have a delicate body. Okay, and that is what makes them more wanted, and that's what makes a geisha so incredibly sought after in the world and expensive. It's because it's delicate, it's got a floral quality, and the body is like tea, which is completely the opposite of what we do in coffee, right? Coffee should taste like coffee, but there's a market for coffees that taste like tea.
Yeah, I think we had a Ethiopian Andaracha a while ago, and that was also quite tea-like. And it did really well.
Yeah, so when I refer to things like body, I'd like the listeners to think of when you take a sip of, let's say, water versus a sip of mango juice. When you refer to body, that's actually what we're referring to. So when you drink coffee, like a cappuccino, obviously it's thick, it tastes like mango juice. But when you drink a V60 with something that has very little oil in it, it will probably taste more like tea. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then we've lastly got honey processing, which is basically we're using a mixture between the two, right? So we're leaving a small amount of the actual pulp on. So you are still getting some jammy and sugary notes from the actual fruit of the coffee. Okay, we're getting a creamier body than we would in washed. Okay, but not as thick as if it's in dry processing. Okay, and it's not as acidic as washed, or they don't think the quality is as high as natural. Okay, so that refers to the body of the coffee. Okay, so it's also nice for our listeners to know that not all acidity is bad. Sometimes you need acidity in coffee to help balance it out. Okay, and this again happens in regions of Brazil and Central America. Okay, so typically a honey processed coffee would have a creamier body, a muted acidity, and often can taste like honey. Okay, so you might get a strawberry jam or a raspberry jam flavor, but never blueberry. Okay, that belongs to dry processing. Right, so you'll get orange citrus, but you will never get citrus that's as hectic as like a lemon. Right, so I just also want to note that coffee is very subjective. So it's up to each person to decide what they like. So this was just an educational segment.
Yeah, everyone is having a crack now because I changed the camera.
Okay. So yeah, that's my little bit on how the flavors are affected. I hope that made sense.
No, Megan, like that was really informative. I think it's an important point that you made at last. You know, sometimes you might think you're going to get a certain flavor profile because a coffee has been natural processed or washed. It's like, you know, these are just indicators. You do get exceptions and varietals, and like there's so many, you know, there's so much coming into play the way it's been roasted as well. So there's quite a lot going on when it comes to coffee, but I hope, you know, like I thought that was a really good summary of, you know, the different methods and how that changes the coffee flavor profile. Yeah, I think you've Megan briefly mentioned the anaerobic fermentation or carbonic fermentation. I was thinking we might get that towards the back end, but I think it might be worthwhile to just mention that, you know, there's quite a lot going on in the processing method, and the latest methods, but I wouldn't say they're cutting edge at the moment, but there's definitely it's a more new method of processing coffee is the anaerobic and carbonic fermentation methods. So in the beginning, we mentioned the washed coffee processing method, where basically the mucilage is fermented in containers with water. So in the anaerobic fermentation, that same process is followed, but basically that fermentation tank is sealed and then all the oxygen is removed. So it does quite a few things. For one, it's, where on a washed coffee, it can be anything, say 9 to 24 hours. But you can actually now do the fermentation process that can go up to 96 hours before, it starts producing alcohols or ethanol, I guess. Basically what the thought behind this processing method is that it pushes the flavors and the juices and the pulps and so forth, or the mucilage, back into the bean using high pressure in the tank. And again, like if you need to have a bit of a summary of the taste, is like it's creamy, silky texture, complex, a bit of a wild acidity, and then notes of cinnamon and flavour. But like I've experienced some that has quite a bourbon type of flavour to it. It's quite actually prominent and thick flavors as well. So it's not just limited to these tasting notes. Then carbonic maceration method. So this method is basically the same as an anaerobic fermentation method, with the key difference between the two is that the carbonic maceration it takes the whole coffee fruit and then places it in the fermentation tank, and so it has the pulp and everything still around, so the whole cherry goes into the fermentation tank, and then the same process is followed with the anaerobic fermentation method, which is that you remove the oxygen from the tank by basically pumping at the bottom carbon dioxide in. I think, Megan, you've mentioned that, in 2005, this was actually started by Sasha Sistik. And he was the world barista champ in 2005 for Australia. So he really started some of this. And what's quite interesting is the management of temperature in this processing method, and how that impacts flavor. So there's a general perception that, say between 4 and 8 degrees, the coffee becomes a bit more complex, acidic, and the acidic is quite delicious if you like acidity, which I do. And then, if the fermentation is done between 18 to 20, there's less acidity and more sweetness and fruitiness. And then after this process has gone through, then you can decide if you want it to follow a natural coffee process or a honey-dried coffee process. So there's one further step to this. And then there's new things happening, which is more cutting edge, I would say, is like the lactic process, where bacteria is added. So there's quite a lot happening at the moment in terms of coffee processing. But other than like the processing of the coffee, it does also have an impact on how you would approach a roast. Frederik at the beginning talked about the density of coffee, but the processing method can also sometimes give you a bit of a indication of how you would approach a roast.
Yeah, so definitely when roasting a coffee, you need to look at it holistically. So the density of a coffee obviously gives you an idea of how to approach it. That's usually impacted by the altitude that the coffee was grown at, and the processing method also has quite a big impact. So when approaching a coffee, usually natural coffees is quite delicate, and with natural coffees I will include honeys because that's very much the same. And you want to preserve, you don't want to attack them with heat, so you want to approach it quite delicately to preserve the sweetness of the cup. But like all things coffee, the sugars you also want to you want to properly develop them through the Maillard reaction to get a really nice sweet coffee balanced while still retaining the flavor. So that's what with a natural becomes quite important is you want to convert those sugars, but you also want to retain the flavor. So approaching it a bit delicately, a bit lower temperatures, you might extend the roast a little bit to get a bit more development of the flavors, and then kind of retain all the added benefits from the mucilage that was entered into the bean. While with a washed coffee, you need to attack it
at first.
You need to go at it quite hard. So generally, let's work on like a 2 kilogram batch. With a natural coffee, we'll typically start roasting it at about 170 degrees, maybe even between 160 and 170. And with a washed coffee, I'll generally approach it around 180. So you already have 10 to 20 degree difference at the start of the roast. If that coffee is dense, you'll maybe even bump that up with like 5 degrees, because the denser coffee is, it's kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? It develops differently because there's less air in it. There's less air gaps, so the heat kind of travels through the bean more efficiently. But so with like a shot in the dark, changing the profile to bringing maximum heat in just before first crack was a new thing for us. So I think it's also important to keep an open mind. There's no fast rule or right rule to roast a coffee. It depends on what you want to get out of it, but it definitely gives you good guidelines to know what coffee you're working with. Obviously, the darker you go, the less acidic the coffee becomes, but the more bitter it becomes. So that's also something to bring into consideration when roasting.
Well, I think it's a valid point that you mentioned there, Frederik. It's having a bit of an openness and not just rigidly following what's always been done. You can obviously see on the processing, there was a big perception that washed coffees are the be all and end all, and if you don't process your coffee using this method, then it's just regarded as substandard. And and it's the same with the coffee roasting. If you aren't open to challenging how things have always been done and actually doing things a bit differently, how can you expect, how do we actually progress and learn more? And how many roasts did we do for that shot in the dark? And it was, and we just did a few things more of the same, a few things a little bit different, but within these almost like known ranges and textbook ranges, and a little bit of lessons learned from the past. But as soon as you put yourself out there to do things a little bit differently, the results can be extraordinary. And I think also going to one extreme to the other teaches you exactly, to really just owns in on that. It owns in on that one variable that you change, and then you really understand what impact it has on, the roasting of coffee, or even if you're preparing a coffee like B60 or whatever, like just changing that one variable can make a big impact. So now on to what your favorite processing method is, and if you have to only drink one processed method for the rest of your life, which would that be? So I'm going to start ladies first. Megan?
So, I like drinking coffee and then finding out afterwards what was actually written on the box. I don't like to judge a coffee, before I've tasted it. Like, you don't read a book by its cover. But I must admit, natural coffees have really been something that I've enjoyed lately. I really love some of the complex fruity flavors that you can get. I always tell people it's strange that like after a long day of tasting espresso-based coffee, I actually just want something that tastes more like tea. So it kind of seems weird. Why would I want a coffee that tastes like tea? And because it's lacquer, that's why. So yeah, I think natural African coffees would be my like go-to.
I think the one thing to remember is there's so many brewing methods that even if you need to choose just one, you can just change it up and get so much different stuff out of it, which is awesome.
Oh,
but yeah, I would. Pete?
No, go for it, Frederik. Your processing method of choice.
I would say a honey. We haven't had many honeys at Gegrond yet. We had a Costa Rica, and I think there was other one that we had in the past. But definitely honeys from like South America.
Nice. But like a dark honey or just a black honey or just a nice lacquer yellow
white honey. Like a red honey.
Okay.
A red honey.
Okay. No, good. Well, there's a part of me that wants to be a bit different and throw out there anaerobic fermented coffee, which, in all fairness, especially at the beginning, I did really like that because the flavors were quite out there. So it was something completely different, and I was just blown away with the flavor profiles that you get. I think I would go with Megan. I am aligned with the natural African coffees. Like I just do really enjoy them, and I remember specifically that Zambia, that we had in stock. That one still is my favorite to date. So I'm hoping we can get a bit more of those in. Maybe it's because I'm in Ireland and I just feel like I need some African coffees to come in, like all the natural African coffees.
We need to cue the Toto Africa song in the podcast here.
I'm going to do that. I'm going to have a morning ritual where it will be like a Zambia coffee with that Toto African song. But thanks, guys. This has been really great. It's been a good chat, and it's good to catch up, hear how things are going with Just Shot in the Dark, and if there's any, we've mentioned it in the past episode as well, but if there's any feedback that you guys have for us, or specific topics that you would like us to discuss, we are on Instagram and Facebook. Just drop us a line or reach out to us on email, and we would be happy to take on board some suggestions. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, guys. It was fun talking to you guys, like always. Just a one note, actually. So the Gegrond team is heading to Maguba's Kloof. We are going to pick coffee cherries and go through the whole processing of the coffees this weekend. So we'll be sure to bring some cherries back as well. So if there's anyone that really is keen to get some cherries to kind of see what it looks like, hit us up and we can definitely arrange something. Otherwise, join us on one of our coffee tastings at Hazeldean Brewing Company in the start of August. Just look on the social media for that info.
Oh, awesome. Thanks for having me, guys. Hopefully I'll be on here more often than not. It was really cool, and I hope I didn't confuse anyone with my super scientific approach to coffee, but just drink it and enjoy it, guys. That's what it's all about.